The following is a summary of the Sicha of Shabbos Parshas Miketz Zois Chanukah Tov Nun. That year, Chanukah was 2 Shabboses. It began with a Shabbos and it ended with a Shabbos. The first Shabbos, all the days of Chanukah were in potential, and hence the Kriyas HaTorah of that Shabbos was B'yoim Himoshach Oisoi, on that day that it was consecrated. And on the last Shabbos, when B'poil you had all the days of Chanukah, the Kriyas of HaTorah was Acharei Himoshach Oisei, once it had been consecrated. In fact, the Midrash tells us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu considered all the offerings of the Nesiim as if all the Nesiim had brought on the first day and all of them had brought on the last day. So all the days are inclusive of each other. So since Chanukah starts with the Shabbos and finishes with the Shabbos as it did on that year, there must be, and there is, a tremendous lesson which can be learned from that in Ner Mitzvah V'Torah Oyer as it applies the entire year. What is that lesson? Let's start with the Nes of the oil of Chanukah. The Beis Yosef asks the famous question, why is it that we celebrate Chanukah for 8 days? After all, there was enough oil in the jar to last for 1 day. So the miracle itself was only 7 days. So how can we celebrate the miracle for 8 days? There are commentaries that answer that the very finding of the jar of oil on the first day was itself a miracle. However, other commentaries do not bring that answer, and for good reason, because the finding of the jar of oil wasn't a completely supernatural miracle. The jar was in fact hidden, it did need some finding, and it was sealed with the seal of the Kohen Gadol, and it could be that the Greeks missed over. It was quite miraculous, so to speak, that they missed that point, but nevertheless, the actual finding of something is not a transcendent miracle, it's not a nes golui, which is why some of the commentaries don't bring that as the answer to the question of the Beis Yosef. However, according to those who do bring the answer, it begs the question, how come the miracle of Chanukah was a miracle that started with something which was natural, although astounding, but natural, that they actually found the jar of oil, which was amazing, but then it continued with something which was completely supernatural. Mimon Avshach, either way, if everything should be in a natural way, then what should have happened is that they should have found a jar of oil in which there was enough oil to light for 8 days. That would have been one straightforward miracle. Or they should have had a miracle that a jar descended from heaven with oil in it, and that oil burned for 8 days. So either it should be totally natural or totally supernatural. How come it started, according to this opinion, with the miracle of finding the jar of oil, which was, if you want, a miracle, but it was within nature, and then it continued with something which was supernatural? We can answer this question by using the famous story of the Alter Rebbe of Yutes Kislev when he was in prison. It's well known that he was imprisoned on an island in St. Petersburg, and when he was taken for interrogation, it was necessary to take him on a boat from his cell from one place to the other. There was a story that the Alter Rebbe was on this boat. It was nighttime, and he wanted to make Kiddush Levana, to sanctify the new moon. And the Alter Rebbe asked the officer in charge whether he would stop the boat so the Alter Rebbe could stand and say Kiddush Levana. The officer refused. And then something quite supernatural happened, that the boat stopped. And the Alter Rebbe said Hallelu, which was the introductory paragraph to the Kiddush Levana. Then the boat continued, and the Alter Rebbe asked again whether they could stop the boat. This time they agreed, and the Alter Rebbe stood up and he made the bracha of Kiddush Levana. Which in this story you can ask exactly the same question. If it was possible for the Alter Rebbe supernaturally to stop the boat in the first instance, how come he only said the introductory paragraph? How come he didn't say the full Kiddush Levana? And the answer is that mitzvahs need to be done al pi teva. They need to be done in the natural realm. Everything needs to be done naturally, including the preparation of the mitzvah. And therefore, it was necessary to be done as close as possible to nature as it was, to do the mitzvah as close as possible to nature as possible. And consequently, although the Alter Rebbe supernaturally, so to speak, stopped the boat to begin with, he wanted the actual bracha of the Kiddush Levana to be done within the parameters of nature, and hence it was only when the boat had continued and the officer agreed then to stop the boat did he actually make the bracha. Now, let's go back to now the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. The reason of the ness of the oil was that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to show Klal Yisrael his tremendous love for them. Because al pi din, they were allowed to light the menorah with oil which was tameh. However, they had Mesiras Nefesh and looked specifically to look for oil which had the seal of the Kohen Gadol on, which was completely tahor. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to show them this, his tremendous love, reciprocal love for their Mesiras Nefesh. However, since mitzvahs need to be done b'derech hateva, therefore he showed this miracle in a way in which it was, if you want, as close as possible to nature that it could possibly be. And that's why the beginning of the Ness of Chanukah was through finding, naturally, a jar of oil. And even the continuity of the miracle was something which was connected with the natural quality of olive oil. And according to both opinions, according to the opinion that there was added in quantity in the oil, in the sense that in the morning they found that the oil had become full again, or according to the opinion that said there was a ness in the quality of the oil, that they divided the oil into 8 parts and an eighth of the oil also burnt for an entire day. Nevertheless, this supernatural miracle was also within a natural order, in the sense the oil burns. It was just that this oil burnt supernaturally for longer than it should have done. And the lesson that we can learn from this is the following. The miracle of the oil emphasizes to us a very important general principle in Torah and mitzvahs. And that is that it has to be done within the nature of the world in such a way that the world itself becomes a vessel and ready for the to be a carrier and a vehicle for Torah and mitzvahs. In fact, the Rambam writes that the promises of the Torah, that if you walk in its statutes, that the rains will be given in their times, those are not the actual reward of the mitzvah, but they facilitate the more mitzvahs in the sense that they take away anything preventing us from doing more mitzvahs. That we should be pnuyim, we should be free to engage in Torah and mitzvahs. In other words, in the natural order of the world, in the Elohim level of godliness, which is the gematria of Teva, the world itself becomes a vehicle for Torah and mitzvahs. And this is the novelty that was in the miracle of the oil of Chanukah, that even in a time of tremendous hell and vehester, of concealment of godliness, so much so that nichnasu hayivonim lehechol, the Greeks entered into the sanctuary, v'timu kol hashmanim, defiled all the oils, in a situation where the world seemingly was completely against Torah and mitzvahs, not only did the Beis Chashmenoi prevail over the Greeks and win the battle against them and nullify the enemy, but what happened is that Teva itself, nature itself, became a vehicle for a miracle. In other words, the oil itself, which naturally should not have burned for 8 days, it was transformed. The oil itself, the very nature of the world itself, was changed into something miraculous. And that applied not only to the mitzvah itself, but also to the hidur mitzvah, to how we do a beautification of a mitzvah. And it has a tremendous lesson to us in the sense that Chanukah is the concept of chinuch, and education teaches us that when we start something, when we begin the education, it shouldn't just be in order to to fulfill a person's obligation, but it should be in a way of mahadrin, min mahadrin. It should be in a very beautiful way. And from this we learn that even nowadays, even in the last moments of Golus, when Yidden are in Golus, even in a choshech kofel u'mechupel, in a very dark, deep darkness, Hashem gives us the opportunity to keep mitzvahs, not just the mitzvah itself, but in a way of hidur, to beautify a mitzvah, in a way in which the nature of the world itself allows us, facilitates us, and gives us menuchas hanefesh, tranquility of spirit, in order to keep the mitzvahs. And this is the tremendous empowerment of the miracle of Chanukah. It gives us this ability that in the last moments of Golus, we can start living with the complete feeling and experience of Geula. Just to amplify that, one may ask that how come there are many, many mitzvahs in Golus that we actually cannot perform? There are many mitzvahs which we can only perform in Unashalma Parim Sfasenu, by learning about them. How is this? The answer is that Golus is the Hepech Teva Ha'olam. Golus itself is the opposite of the nature of the world. The world was created, Bereshis bara Elokim, Bishvil HaTorah, Bishvil Yisrael. And it's the opposite of the nature of a Jew. The innate and essential nature of a Jew is to want to do Torah and mitzvahs. Nevertheless, comes along Golus, and it conceals the very nature of the world and the very nature of the Jew, and it creates a darkness. Now, in that darkness, it's enough in this present state for Unashalma Parim Sfasenu that at least we can learn and say and mention about mitzvahs that we can't actually physically do, and then we've done as much as we possibly can and we've fulfilled the mitzvah. Give you an example of that. Take a Ger Tzedek, somebody who converts to Judaism. In the times of the Beis HaMikdash, he would have to have Mila, Tvila, and Korban. He'd have to have a circumcision, immersion in a mikveh, and also bring a korban, and then he would be considered a Ger Tzedek. Nowadays, it's impossible to bring a korban because we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. Nevertheless, as long as the ger does Mila and Tefillah, he's considered 100% Jew, and his children are considered Jewish. So we see that as much as we can do now, that's the best that we can do. And that's how it is in most mitzvahs. However, in the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, we have a chidush, we have something which is quite novel. And that is that in the mitzvah of Chanukah, we have something novel, that there's an empowerment in the mitzvah of Chanukah, that the very nature of the world is that it's ready for the Geula. How do we see that? We see that the Korbanos HaNesiim, the offerings which the Nesiim brought, we read them on Chanukah, and it says that when Aaron HaKohen saw the offerings of the Nesiim, he was upset. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to him, don't be upset. Your avodah is greater than their avodah because you will light the menorah. And that's why Ba'aloischos, we read the Ba'aloischos straight after the Korbanos HaNesiim. So there is a certain advantage of the Hadlokas HaMenorah over the Korbanos of the Nesiim. What is that advantage? And Befrat, according to the question of the Ramban, that the lighting of the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash also ceased once the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. So the Ramban answers true. However, the Neiros Chanukah einam b'teilus l'olam. The lights of Chanukah never cease. They will continue for eternity. So we see that there's something in the lights of Chanukah which is eternal, greater than the bringing of the Korbanos. In other words, greater even than we actually saying the Korbanos nowadays. There's something greater in lighting the Chanukah menorah, and that is that when we light these 8 lights, we're getting ready for the Geula, which is connected with the number 8. And that's connected with the 8 strings of the harp of Mashiach, and it's connected with the number 8, which transcends the number 7. This is even more emphasized when we consider the concept of oil itself. The oil itself, the shemen, relates to the Pnimius HaTorah. And the idea of Hafotzas HaMayanos Chutza is the idea of the wide dissemination of this Pnimius HaTorah. And certainly in nowadays, after the Arizal who said Muta u mitzvah legala zois hachochma, that it is a mitzvah to reveal this wisdom of the inner Torah, and certainly after all the generations of the Nesiei Chabad, and especially the generation in which the Frierdiker Rebbe told us that Hafotzas HaMayonos is the special mitzvah of this generation, and it's connected with Mashiach, which Al Yedei through Hafotzas HaMayonos Chutza Ka'osi Mar. So we already have the beginnings of, and we already have the shlemus of the Geula Hasidah hinted to in the lights, in the 8 lights of Chanukah. And that's connected with the concept of Chanukah, the lights of Chanukah, that they're lit after the Shkia, ad dekalia rigla de Talmudoim and Ashuk, until the feet of the Talmudians are taken away from the market, which means that the Teva Ha'olam, the nature of the world itself, is in such a way that it brings to the Geula, and this itself was most emphasized in the coming of the Frierdiker Rebbe to the United States of America, the Chatzi Kader HaTachton, from which he permeated the entire world, that the world itself should be full of Hafotzas HaMayonos Chutza, and he did that from a place in which Matan Torah did not happen in that hemisphere, which emphasizes that the world itself is now becoming a place which is ready for Geula. And the Chidush of the United States is the inyan of Harchava Begashmias, of tremendous plenty and material plenty. And that gives us the possibility to keep Torah mitzvahs in a very beautiful way, that the Limud HaTorah is B'harchava, the Kiyum HaMitzvahs is B'harchava Sadas, and in a way of Chabad, in previous generations, Yidden were oisek, Yidden engaged in Limud HaTorah mitoich oni, out of tremendous poverty. In the days of the Alter Rebbe, in the days of the Mittel Rebbe, they couldn't even print what they wanted to, had to print limited editions because they simply didn't have enough money. However, Nowadays, Baruch Hashem, and this is one of the chidushim of Nasi Doreinu, that the world itself has become such a vessel for Hafotzas Hamayonos Chutza. And this is achieved in the 2 Shabbos of Chanukah. The first Shabbos, it says, Kol Malachtecha Asuya, when Shabbos comes in, all your work has been done, meaning the refining of the work, the refining of the world has already been achieved, and particularly after the accumulative effect of all the previous generations, the Sheish Shonim Tizra Sadecha, of the 6 years sowing your fields, now we have a Bayom HaShvi Tishbeis, we're ready for the Geula. The Hira which we can learn from all the above is that we need to add on in Neir Mitzvah B'Torah Or, in learning Torah with a tremendous expanse, B'Shofi. We should steal time away from our Parnasa, and then HaKadosh Baruch Hu for sure will compensate that with a Ribui Kesef, a tremendous wealth for one's personal needs, for Sachar Limud, for paying of tuition fees, for marrying of children, and for everything that the household needs. And especially enough money for the Hafotza which we need to do. And we should know that the money is already b'mezuman, it's already in cash. It's either in one's pocket, or it's on the shelf, or it could be that one just simply needs to go to a place and take the money from there. What is most important to know is that it's already been given into your possession in order to use it for the Hafotza. And it should start on Shabbos by making an additional Farbrengen at the time of Shalosh Shudas, certainly to make a Farbrengen by Malav and Malka, and since Mefakrim al Tzorchet Tzibur, since we should speak about the needs of the community on Shabbos, we should also speak about Demei Chanukah, Chanukah Geld, giving out as an education for sons and daughters. And Yehi Rotzen, that all of the above should bring to the Zois Chanukahs HaMizbeach, the chinuch of the menorah through Moshe and Aaron, who will bring the Geula Miketz at the end, bringing to a Vayigash, a meeting of Hashem Echad U'Shmei Echad, which Shmei goes on Sadikim, because Sadikim are called after the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then Hashem Echad U'Shmei Echad, Yisrael V'Kud Shebrichu, Kula Chad, Yidden and the Eibishter all being one.